Let's talk now, though, to Harry Phone, Grassroots Campaign Manager at the Taxpayers Alliance, because we've been talking earlier with my guests Neil Wallace and Eric McElroy about the BBC. The government does seem to be very determined to do something about the BBC licence fee. They certainly want to decriminalise non-payment of the licence fee, and they want to stop locking people up for not paying it. But rather more interestingly, I think, certainly, Harry, and a very good morning to you, I'm quite liking their idea of slimming it down as well.
Good morning, Mike. Yeah, very much so. I mean, we've been calling for the TV tax to be axed for absolutely years now, because we think it's simply unfair that you're asking people to pay what will be £157.50 from April, simply for owning a television. So we very much welcome this news, and it's been interesting seeing a lot of the comments from people. They seem to think that this is going to be the end of the BBC, but it's no one's advocating getting rid of the BBC. We're just advocating changing the funding model.
Well, quite, because one of the things we've been talking about this morning is that oftentimes people will say, oh, isn't it great, though, you can watch the BBC and, of course, you don't have to have any adverts. Well, lots of people do that now. I mean, you can watch Amazon without adverts, you can watch Netflix without adverts, you can even watch Talk Radio on YouTube without adverts, he said, giving himself a shameless plug. But, the bottom line is that, they've got a lot of competition now, and my view has always been the BBC doesn't really have any business producing shows like Strictly, because that is an entertainment show purely and simply based on paying loads of people loads of money, including the judges and the contestants, for no apparent gain, because the BBC shouldn't be worried about ratings.
Yeah, very good point. I mean, this is the thing. Things have changed substantially in this market. We've seen the advent of, live streaming. Also, even in the sets that people now have for television, a lot of people are recording a program and then watching it later when they get home, and they can just fast forward through the adverts. It's interesting that people are saying, BBC does great shows and all this, and if we get rid of the licence fee, it's the end of the BBC. Well, I'm sorry, but if it's doing great shows, then it should have no problem selling these shows. More competition, I think, is good for the BBC. Anytime we have more competition in the market, what do we usually see happen? We usually see that prices go down, but the quality of the products and services on offer usually increase.
Well, exactly right. And some of the things that the government wants to do are these: force the BBC to sell off the vast majority of its 61 radio stations. There's a number that we were looking for earlier. Safeguard Radio 3 and Radio 4, that's fine. Scale back the BBC website, which is absolutely right to do. And this is my favourite one: ban BBC stars from cashing in with lucrative second jobs. We saw just the other day the head of news at the BBC had to hand back 12 grand that he got for a speaking engagement, which he's only got because he's the head of BBC News. He shouldn't be doing that, should he?
I think you're right, and I think people feel that the only reason he's been able to command that sort of salary is through the generosity of the taxpayer.
Yeah.
Something, his salary and his job, which has given him this profile. And I can understand why people feel quite upset about that. Interesting, you mentioned the radio stations as well, the local radio stations. And I should say the Taxpayers Alliance do get on a number of these BBC local stations, but it's a classic example of where the BBC has an effective monopoly on something, and it's to the detriment of hundreds and thousands potentially of local commercial broadcasters that could have taken their place. So I quite like the plans by the government here, and I think if the BBC had stayed like this from the start, we probably wouldn't even be having this conversation. If the licence fee was, say, anywhere between £30 and £40 a year. Right,
exactly, and it doesn't have to pay for this great behemoth. I think they employ something like 22,000 people at the BBC, and I was hearing from someone the other day about the fact that they're laying off all these journalists from Radio 5 Live, and people who've worked there say all that will happen is that they'll lay all these people off and then they'll rehire them as freelancers like the next week.
Yeah, quite possibly. I think when we look at it, the world has changed so much, and the idea that you get everything you want from the BBC just simply isn't true anymore. I was thinking earlier about if you're someone that likes sport, for example. Maybe 20 years ago the BBC offered you good service on this, but it's not the case anymore. And I think if the government does go to the subscription model, you can have this opportunity where if people just want the basics, they can have the basics, but if they want to add things on, they're absolutely welcome to do so. But when you're paying £157.50, for the average family, that is an awful lot of money. It puts food on the table for a week, and it's no surprise to us that back in the summer when we did polling on this, 70% of working class voters wanted to see this tax done away with. Yeah,
exactly right. And do you fear that this is the government kind of cashing in on the public's, shall we say, distaste for some of the BBC political coverage that's been going on? We've already got a situation, kind of a standoff between the government and Radio 4, where the government is saying that we're not going to put any more ministers up for the Today programme because it's too biased.
Well, it's one of the interesting things that the left always think it's biased to the right, and the right always think it's biased to the left, which could be an indication that they're doing something right. I mean, whatever the government's motivation, I ultimately think this is the right thing to do. I mean, as I say, we've been calling for this for a number of years, and we very much welcomed the fact that there's going to be a review into decriminalising the licence fee. As I'm sure you know, that takes up 1 in 10 magistrates cases across the country, which is a tremendous amount of time. So I'm not going to question their motivation for it, but I very much welcome this news, and I think many other taxpayers across the country will too.
And knowing what you know about the local sort of markets that you talk to in terms of the local news stations, I mean, there's no reason why they could not be run commercially, is there?
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of these shows are actually very good, and the presenters, should not be worried about the fact that they might have to have some adverts on the show. If they, as I say, if you've got a good show, it's going to succeed in a commercial marketplace. If you've got a bad show, it goes. I think this is the problem with the BBC. For too long, they've been able to carry bad shows. Without that, I mean, what other market can you operate in where you don't have to worry about making a profit? It's a very nice luxury they have. And especially in this day and age where we have the internet, I think the role of a BBC local radio station